In a quiet and prosperous suburb where every house is hidden behind perfectly trimmed lawns and manicured gardens, life moved on at its own measured pace. This is a place where neighborhood children run around the streets and people greet each other warmly without even knowing their names. But under this mask of idol, there were hidden personal dramas and tense relationships that no one knew about. One of these dramas suddenly spilled out, turning the life of a small community upside down. Emily Hartman, a young woman with a bright smile known for her friendliness and active involvement in the local community, was found dead in her home. Her death shocked everyone who knew her, especially because she seemed so removed from any conflict. Emily had a successful career and good friends, but her personal life, as it later turned out, was far from ideal. The morning when Emily didn't go for a run as usual was the first warning sign. Her neighbor, Mrs. Graham, concerned about Emily's absence, approached the house and noticed that the door was unlocked. Entering inside, she saw a terrible picture. Emily was lying on the floor in the living room, motionless, with obvious signs of violent death. The police were called and quickly cordoned off the scene, and an investigation began that was supposed to shed light on this mysterious tragedy. Detective John Martin, one of the best in the business, was assigned to the case. John was a man of principles and always carefully examined every detail, knowing that any little thing could turn out to be key. His many years of experience have taught him to be skeptical and not accept the obvious as truth. Even before he set foot on Emily's doorstep, he knew that this death was not a simple coincidence. The house where the tragedy occurred looked like a scene from a crime thriller. There are signs of struggle everywhere: an overturned chair, a broken vase, abandoned books. However, upon closer inspection, John noticed some oddities. There were no signs of forced entry into the house, and the perpetrator seemed to know where every item was. This suggested that the killer was someone who knew Emily well. Police began interviewing neighbors to try to find out who might have seen or heard anything suspicious the night before the murder. However, as often happens in such cases, people either did not see anything or did not want to talk. However, from conversations with local residents, it became clear that Emily had a difficult personal past, which may have played a role in her death. Neighbors recalled that several years ago, Emily went through a difficult divorce. Her ex-husband, Michael Hartman, left a shadow in her life. People heard them arguing more than once, and saw Michael coming to Emily's house even after they officially broke up. But no one knew how serious this situation was and what threats Michael could pose to her life. As John continued to examine the crime scene, he became increasingly convinced that this murder had been carefully planned. No random tracks, no obvious clues. Everything was done to confuse the investigators. The only indisputable fact remained: Emily's death. But its cause was still shrouded in darkness. John understood that this matter would require all his intuition and experience. The investigation into the murder of Emily Hartman began to take shape from the first minutes after the discovery of her body. Detective John Martin, methodical and pedantic in his work, already knew that every murder is a puzzle that must be assembled from many pieces. The first thing he did was carefully study the crime scene, trying to catch even the smallest details that could help solve this mystery. Emily's house was typical of the area: a two-story cottage with a spacious living room, a cozy kitchen, and several bedrooms on the second floor. However, on that fateful day, all these details lost their meaning. Only one thing was important: to find the one who took Emily's life. A team of forensic scientists methodically examined every corner of the house. The front door was not forced, indicating that Emily either knew the killer and let him in herself, or the door remained unlocked. In the living room where the body was found, traces of a struggle were found: an overturned table, scattered books and pillows, shards of glass from a broken vase. However, there were no signs of chaos typical of a robbery or a random argument, which made John wonder about the motive for the crime. The main question that worried the detective was, why? Why did a young, successful woman who seemed completely harmless become the target of such a brutal attack? And why did the killer decide to kill her in this way? John understood that the answer lay in Emily's past. her connections and relationships. The first step was to interview Emily's closest friends and colleagues. Emily's childhood friend Sarah worked with her at the local school where Emily taught. Sarah recalled that lately, Emily had often complained of fatigue and nervous tension, although she never disclosed the details. This was alarming because Emily had always been a person who knew how to cope with difficulties and did not let stress take over. Neighbors also contributed to the investigation. Mrs. Graham, a neighbor across the street, said she often saw Emily returning home late at night, sometimes looking worried or upset. However, this did not cause real alarm in her. Perhaps Emily was simply going through difficult times. Detective John Martin was an experienced investigator, but even he knew that at this stage, all possibilities remained possible. The murder could have been the work of either a random perpetrator or someone close to Emily. Therefore, he decided to focus on Emily's past and her relationships with the people who surrounded her. John paid particular attention to Michael Hartman, Emily's ex-husband. Their marriage broke up several years ago, but according to neighbors, Michael still sometimes visited Emily's house, and their meetings were not always peaceful. Neighbors recalled several occasions when Emily and Michael loudly quarreled in the street, although the details of these quarrels remained unknown. Michael, a middle-aged entrepreneur, owned a small business in the city. After the divorce, he moved to a nearby area but seemed unable to completely sever his connection with Emily. John knew that such relationships filled with unspoken emotions and hidden grievances often became the basis for tragedy. Meanwhile, criminologists began to receive the first results of the analysis. No fingerprints were found at the crime scene, indicating that the killer was either careful or wore gloves. Signs of strangulation were found on Emily's body, indicating that the killer wanted to take her life in this manner, perhaps out of personal hatred or a desire to control her until the very end. John Martin understood that the investigation had just begun, and many difficult decisions and difficult conversations lay ahead. However, he was determined to get to the bottom of the truth, because every new piece of evidence, every new fact, brought him closer to the solution. Solving this murder required not only professionalism, but also a subtle understanding of human psychology, the ability to see behind the visible picture what is hidden from view. With each new day of investigation, John plunged deeper into Emily's story, her fears and hopes, which may have led her to a tragic end. He knew that at every step there would be false leads and red herrings, but the true killer would definitely leave behind a trail that would be impossible to hide. The investigation gradually deepened, and Detective John Martin began to understand the complex relationships surrounding Emily Hartman. In this quiet suburb, everyone seemed to know everyone, but in reality many things remained hidden behind closed doors and unspoken words. It became obvious to John that to understand what led to the murder, he needed to look deeper into Emily's personal life. Emily and Michael Hartman got married 10 years ago. Their marriage began as something out of a romantic story. They met at work, their relationship quickly developed, and soon they were standing at the altar, promising each other eternal love and support. However, as often happens, the reality turned out to be much more complicated. Their marriage gradually began to crack at the seams, and after 7 years they decided to divorce. John began to study in detail the divorce documents and their correspondence during this period. A world of quarrels, reproaches, and insults opened up to him, which for a long time remained hidden from prying eyes. Emily and Michael fought over custody of their only child, a daughter named Lily. The court decided to leave Lily with her mother, which further increased the tension in the relationship between the former spouses. But the real tragedy was that, despite the official divorce, their conflict did not stop. Michael couldn't seem to come to terms with the fact that he had lost Emily. He continued to look for reasons to meet, came to her house without warning, sometimes late at night, when Lily was already asleep. Neighbors recalled hearing their screams, but no one intervened. Private matters should remain private. John also spoke to Emily's close friends. They said that after the divorce, she tried for a long time to start life from scratch, but Michael constantly interfered with her plans. Friends recalled how Emily complained of a feeling of constant tension and fear. Her nervousness increased over time, although she tried not to show it to her daughter. One of the key figures in Emily's life was her colleague and friend Sarah. It was Sarah who was the person to whom Emily trusted her most intimate thoughts. Over the years, they had supported each other through difficult times. And now Sarah worried about her friend more than ever. She recalled how Emily told her that Michael had repeatedly threatened her if she tried to start a new relationship or completely cut herself off from him. John realized that Michael had a strong motive for hurting Emily. His sense of possessiveness, inability to come to terms with the divorce, and fear of losing control of his daughter made him the prime suspect. However, there has not yet been direct evidence of his guilt. Michael denied any accusations, claiming that he only wanted to maintain contact with his daughter and preserve at least the remnants of the family. Meanwhile, John continued to gather evidence, trying to understand how far Michael might have gone in his desire to regain control over his life and his ex-wife. He studied recordings from surveillance cameras in the area, trying to find confirmation of Michael's words or, conversely, to catch him in a lie. In addition, the detective decided to talk to Lily, Emily, and Michael's daughter. The girl, despite her young age, could provide important details that might seem insignificant to adults. Lily, although withdrawn after her mother's death, still told John about how her father often appeared at the house, sometimes angry, sometimes just sad, but always with something on his soul. John realized that Michael's emotions played a key role in this tragedy. His inability to come to terms with his divorce and his loss of control over the situation made him a potentially dangerous person. But was this sufficient reason for murder? And if so, why did he choose such a moment to attack? Plunging deeper into the tangled tangle of human relationships and emotions, John felt how all the details began to form into a single picture. But there were still questions that needed to be answered. For example, could someone else take advantage of the situation and commit murder by framing Michael? Or did it really all come down to his painful obsession? Each new information introduced new doubts and assumptions. The investigation continued, and the detective knew that time was against him. With each passing day, evidence could disappear and traces could become lost. But he also knew that the truth would always find its way to the light if you looked hard enough for it. With each new day, the investigation acquired more and more nuances. John Martin knew that focusing on just one version would be a mistake. He was an experienced detective, and his instinct was to consider all possible options until there was complete clarity. That is why, when a new suspect suddenly burst into the investigation, John decided not to lose sight of this trail. Robert Wilson, Emily's neighbor, suddenly found himself in the spotlight. Until this point, his name had not come up in conversation, but one of the neighbors told police that he had seen Robert near Emily's house on the night of the murder. This fact seemed especially important to John, given that Robert was officially supposed to be elsewhere. He claimed that that evening he was with a friend out of town. Robert was a lonely man, reserved and reserved. His neighbors knew him superficially, a man who rarely socialized but was always polite. In such cases, it was easy to assume that Robert could not have had any motive for committing such a crime. However, John began to have doubts about certain details of his behavior. When John brought Robert in for questioning, he seemed calm but slightly nervous. Robert answered confidently to questions about what he was doing on the night of the murder, claiming that he was with a friend and that he had witnesses who could confirm this. However, there was something strange in his testimony. He was confused about small things several times, which made John wonder about the veracity of his words. Robert also mentioned that he only knew Emily superficially, but always treated her with respect. He said that he sometimes helped her with housework if she asked, and sometimes they exchanged short conversations on the street, but John couldn't shake the feeling that Robert was hiding something. Meanwhile, forensic scientists examined possible evidence related to Robert. Surprisingly, no traces were found at the crime scene that could clearly indicate his presence. However, this insignificance also seemed suspicious, as if Robert was trying to avoid leaving any traces. Neighbors described Robert as strange, but not aggressive. Many of them could not even remember the last time they saw him. Some mentioned that Robert sometimes acted withdrawn, as if trying to avoid contact with others, but this was not considered anything unusual. However, one of the neighbors mentioned that in the last weeks before the murder, Robert began to look especially depressed and nervous, as if something was really bothering him. John began to look into Robert's past, and it soon became clear that he had suffered several personal tragedies. His wife passed away several years ago, leaving Robert deeply depressed. After her death, he withdrew into himself and almost completely stopped communicating with people. This might explain his isolation and reluctance to communicate, but it did not explain why he was near Emily's house on the night of her death. Meanwhile, John decided to check Robert's alibi. He spoke to the friend Robert was supposedly visiting that night and learned that they had indeed met, but the friend could not remember exactly when Robert had left. This created uncertainty and left open the possibility that Robert could return to the city without attracting attention. Another detail also emerged. A few weeks ago, Robert unexpectedly bought expensive tools that were found in his home. This was strange, considering that he had never been interested in repairs before. John wondered if Robert could have used these tools for something else. Despite all his suspicions, John did not have enough evidence to accuse Robert. However, intuition suggested that Robert could be connected with this case, albeit not directly. Perhaps he saw or knew something, but was afraid to tell. John decided not to rush to conclusions and continue to study this possible direction, while simultaneously checking other versions. With every new step, John got closer to the solution, but the true motive and identity of the killer remained hidden. In this quiet suburb where everyone seemed to know each other, much remained unclear. But the detective knew that the truth would be revealed sooner or later, and every trace, even the smallest, could become decisive in this complex investigation. The investigation continued, and John Martin felt that he was plunging deeper into a web of lies and omissions. Despite the many leads, the case of Emily Hartman's death remained extremely confusing. Each new suspect or witness brought its share of doubts and questions, which further complicated the task. John understood that somewhere in this tangle the truth was hiding, but it was disguised under a layer of false traces. Robert Wilson remained the center of attention, but despite his strange behavior and some suspicious facts, John could not find clear evidence of his guilt. Moreover, Robert's alibi, although not impeccable, was still confirmed by his friend. This made John think perhaps he was heading in the wrong direction and Robert was just a random piece in this complex game. One of the investigators working with John suggested checking another possibility, the possibility that Emily's death was the result of an accidental attack. Perhaps someone was trying to rob the house and Emily was in the wrong place at the wrong time. However, strangely enough, no signs of robbery were found in the house. Valuables remained in their places and nothing was stolen. This refuted the version of a random crime. However, John decided not to miss this opportunity and sent a team to re-examine the crime scene. It was necessary to make sure they didn't miss anything. Perhaps there were details that at first glance seemed insignificant but could turn out to be important. During the second inspection, a small detail was discovered, a scratch on the door handle, which had not previously been noticed. Although it could have been an accident, John decided to have it tested to see if someone had left behind any DNA evidence. While forensic scientists were working on new evidence, John decided to return to the first suspect, Michael Hartman, Emily's ex-husband. John knew that Michael had a strong motive for committing the crime, and even though all his actions seemed justified, something in his behavior haunted the detective. John conducted another interrogation of Michael. This time he decided to approach things more aggressively, asking questions that would trigger Michael's emotions and force him to talk more than he had planned. Michael seemed to remain calm, but sometimes a strange mixture of anger and anxiety flashed in his eyes. John caught this moment when Michael started talking about the divorce and how unfair it was the court's decision to leave Lily with her mother. Michael's emotions became clear in his words, but he continued to insist that he would never harm Emily. Meanwhile, another unexpected turn intervened in the matter. John was approached by a woman named Megan, who claimed to have information that could help the investigation. Megan worked at a local cafe and often saw Emily, who came there for coffee. She said that several times she noticed Emily dating a man she didn't know. These meetings were always quiet, but at the last meeting, Megan said, Emily seemed tense and the man looked visibly upset. This information added even more questions. Who was this man, and what was his role in Emily's life? Perhaps it was a lover, or someone with whom Emily discussed important matters. John decided to find this man, hoping that he could shed light on the last days of Emily's life. However, despite all efforts, none of the lines of investigation have provided clear answers. Every time John thought he had found the right trail, he encountered a new obstacle that confused him. The false trails became more and more confusing, and John began to realize that someone might be deliberately leading him astray. Meanwhile, analysis of the scratch on the door handle did not yield useful results. There were no DNA traces found on the pen that could point to anyone in particular. This only deepened the feeling that the matter was becoming more complex and unclear. John realized that he was approaching a critical point where difficult decisions had to be made. He could either continue to follow these fuzzy trails, or he could try to re-examine all the evidence from a new perspective, perhaps paying attention to details that previously seemed insignificant. The investigation reached a dead end, but John Martin was not going to give up. He understood that every false lead he checked brought him closer to the real solution, even if it was not noticeable at first glance. However, to move the case forward, he needed new evidence, new pieces of the puzzle that could lead to a solution. It seemed that all possibilities had been exhausted, but John decided to return to what did not initially attract his attention. He began going through Emily's personal belongings again, trying to find anything that could point to her final days and perhaps a motive for the murder. Among documents and letters that previously did not seem important, John came across an old letter addressed to Emily from her friend Sarah. In the letter, Sarah thanked Emily for her help during a difficult period, mentioning that she always supported her, especially after the divorce. But what really caught John's attention was the mention that Emily was under stress herself due to recent threats from Michael. Sarah wrote that Emily was afraid for her life and even thought about leaving town temporarily, but did not want to leave Lily. This discovery made John take a fresh look at the matter. If Emily really did receive threats from Michael, it could explain a lot of things that previously seemed insignificant. He decided to conduct further investigation into Michael's financial affairs to see if he might have any ulterior motives for the murder. Meanwhile, analysis of a scratch on a doorknob that was found in Emily's house did not yield any useful information. But forensic scientists decided to conduct a more in-depth analysis of the situation in the house in order to identify possible hidden evidence. During this analysis, another interesting detail was discovered. On the carpet in the living room where Emily's body was found, there was a faint shoe print that had previously been overlooked due to its blurriness. This print did not appear to match any previously collected samples of Michael's or Robert's shoes. This could indicate a third person was present at the crime scene, but whose identity remained unknown. John decided to request a re-examination of all surveillance videos in the area, hoping that this would help identify the man. In addition, the detective decided to conduct additional interviews, starting with Emily's friends and colleagues, to find out whether anyone else from her circle could have been involved in this crime. It soon became clear that a few weeks before the murder, Emily began receiving strange calls from unknown numbers. These calls bothered her, but she never said what exactly they told her on the phone. John decided to track these numbers, and the results were not long in coming. One of the numbers turned out to be registered to a dummy, but after several days of careful work, it was possible to find out that the number was associated with one of Michael's old acquaintances, a person with whom he once did business, but about whom he did not mention anything during interrogations. This man, named Thomas Grace, had a reputation for having a dark past. He has been involved in several dubious transactions and has previously been prosecuted for fraud. Although his connection to Michael was not obvious, it could provide new clues that John had been looking for so long. John decided to arrange a meeting with Thomas to talk to him personally and find out why he was calling Emily. Thomas initially denied everything, claiming that he had nothing to do with the case, but under pressure he began to drop hints that he had information that might interest the detective. He didn't want to speak directly, but his behavior betrayed anxiety and fear. Thomas said that he knew about the conflicts between Emily and Michael, and that Michael repeatedly turned to him for help in matters related to money. But most importantly, He hinted at the possibility that Michael could use him for his own personal gain, including threatening and pressuring Emily. John realized that a new line of investigation had opened up before him, which could lead to a solution. Michael may have used old connections and influence to intimidate Emily into returning to his control. But something went wrong, and the situation got out of control. The final part of the investigation required John Martin's complete focus and attention to detail. He knew he was on the verge of solving a crime, but a key question remained unsolved. How were Michael Hartman and Thomas Grace connected, and what exactly led to Emily's death? John was ready for a difficult conversation with Michael, but first he needed to put all the evidence together. John spent several tense days studying Michael's financial records and his connection to Thomas. It turned out that Michael was heavily in debt to Thomas, and their financial relationship was far from harmless. Thomas pressured Michael to repay the debt, but Michael apparently did not have the means to pay it off. This could be one of the reasons why Michael started pursuing Emily. He was hoping to get money or property to pay off his debts. In addition, it turned out that Michael had repeatedly called Emily in recent weeks, and some of the calls coincided with the same strange calls from an unknown number that were bothering her. John began to realize that Michael could be using Thomas to intimidate Emily, hoping to force her to make concessions or return to the relationship. However, these threats got out of control, which led to the tragedy. John collected all the evidence and prepared a warrant for Michael's arrest. The meeting with him was carefully planned. John wanted Michael to feel safe before realizing that he had been exposed. They met in John's office, where Michael once again tried to assure the detective of his innocence, but this time John was adamant. "We know you used Thomas to intimidate Emily," John said, watching Michael's reaction. He lost his composure for a moment, but quickly pulled himself together. "It was just pressure! I didn't want to kill her!" Michael exclaimed, realizing that he had said too much. John, having grasped this moment, continued to put pressure on him, bringing to light all the details of their conspiracy. Michael tried to justify himself, claiming that he did not want to harm Emily, but was only trying to get her to agree to his terms. However, all the evidence collected indicated that he had gone much further than he had originally thought. Under pressure from debt and despair, Michael decided to commit a crime, not realizing that the consequences would be so tragic. At this time, John received the results of the latest analysis of a shoe print found at the crime scene. As it turned out, this print belonged to Thomas Grace. John used this evidence to get Thomas to confess to his role in bullying Emily. Thomas, realizing that he could no longer escape responsibility, agreed to cooperate with the investigation in exchange for a reduced sentence. He said that he helped Michael organize threats against Emily, but when it came to the murder, he could not back down and tried to cover his tracks. Michael was arrested and arraigned on charges of first-degree murder. Thomas, who received a cooperation agreement, also received punishment, but to a lesser extent. The trial revealed all the horrific details. Michael, seeing no other way out of his financial and personal disaster, decided to take extreme measures to regain control of his life, not realizing that this would lead him to disaster. John Martin, having completed this complex and intricate investigation, bitterly realized that many crimes are born out of despair and human weaknesses. This story, full of deception, fear, and betrayal, left its mark not only in the documents of the case, but also in the heart of the detective. He understood that every crime solved is not just a solution to a mystery, but also evidence of how easily life can collapse under the weight of wrong decisions. John's final words to his team were simple. "Sometimes the hardest thing is to see the truth when it is hidden behind lies. But if we are persistent enough, the truth will always find its way out." And this time the truth was exposed, but at too high a price.